Hi everyone. Today I'm going to talk to you about Anne Bradstreet, Mary Rowlandson, and Cotton Mather. Kind of an interesting eclectic group, but there are some connections. So we're going to start with Anne Bradstreet. She was born in England. Her father ensured that she receive an education superior to her peers. This is extremely unusual at this time. Young women do not get educated. But however, she was. As a young child, she had rheumatic fever and she suffered from fatigue a great deal when she came to the New World. When she was 16, she married, and shortly thereafter, her family sailed to America along with John Winthrop in 1630. She gave birth 8 times. That's remarkable in and of itself because, we live in a time, or she lived in a time that did not have medical care, prenatal care, or anything like that. So the fact that she gave birth 8 times is pretty significant, especially when you consider that she was sickly. She really wasn't all that happy about coming to America. She was not looking forward to giving up the comforts of her home. She admitted that her heart rose in protest against the world, the new world, and new manners. Although she ostensibly reconciled herself to the Puritan mission, she wrote that she submitted to it and joined the church at Boston. Bradstreet remains ambivalent about most of the issues of salvation and redemption for most of her life. So she is not your typical devout uh, Puritan. She really is in love with her husband. She comes because of her husband and her family, and she's really not looking forward to it. She would much rather have stayed at her cozy home in England. Upon arriving, according to Thomas Dudley, Bradstreet's father, we found the colony in a sad and unexpected condition. Above 80 of them had been dead the winter before, and many of those alive weak and sick, all the corn and bread amongst them all hardly sufficient to feed them a fortnight. So she comes into a real scary situation when her family arrives. And again, she's a young woman. She's not very old, probably not as old as most of you in this class. And she comes to this new world, and there's not a lot of food. There aren't a lot of resources. 80 people died the previous winter, so it's not terribly optimistic. Um, she began writing poetry when she was a child. She loves nature and sees evidence of God in the land, sky, and sea. And we know this is a typical Puritan trope that they see God in the world around them. Her brother-in-law takes a collection of her poems to London and had it printed as The Tenth Muse Lately Sprung Up in America in 1650. And the first volume of poetry published by a colonist and was reprinted in 1678. So she's really important, not just to American literature, but to American, or not just American poetry, but to American literature, because she's one of the first colonists to ever get published in England, and the fact that she's a woman is a pretty big deal, because women weren't supposed to be writing; they were supposed to be caring for their families, and we can tell she had a good-sized family to care for. So she is still considered one of the most important early American poets, even today. She has established herself within a hierarchical culture that considered women subservient to men and men subservient to God. She is one of the first published authors, I just said that, in the colonies, and her early poems engage historical and political themes and draw heavily from English and French literary sources, which again is evidence of her education, of her being such a well-educated young woman. Her most powerful work is considered to be her later, more personal poems, where she speaks in a confident voice about her own experiences as a Puritan woman. In these poems, she conveys her love for her husband and her devastating grief at the loss of her 3 young grandchildren. Two of her most acclaimed and highly anthologized poems demonstrate her pleasure in the world and her struggle to subordinate the natural world to the divine one. And by that, what I mean is that to her, the natural world was divine, but in the Puritan, the natural world is a reflection of the divine. So that's a little bit different, and that was a little that was challenging for her to determine those differences. She Bradstreet sees in the natural world evidence of the divine and speaks to transcend the beauty of nature to embrace eternal joy. Within a restrictive culture that punished women for leaving the domestic sphere or questioning authority, Bradstreet manages to assert a poetic voice, a powerful and eloquent voice that would inspire and influence American poets in her time and today. So she really is a very well respected poet, and I think that her poetry is accessible, it's understandable, um, and it's full of a lot of depth and emotion. So this is one of her most favorite poems to my dear and loving husband. If ever two were one, then surely we. If ever man were loved by wife, then thee. If ever wife was happy in a man, compare me with ye women if you can. I prize thy love more than whole mines of gold, for all the riches that the east doth hold. My love is such that rivers cannot quench, nor aught but love from thee give recompense. Thy love is such I can no way repay. The heavens reward thee manifold, I pray. Then while we live in love let's so persevere, that when we live no more we may live ever. So what she's talking about in this poem, and it's kind of saucy in a way, if you dig a little bit beyond the surface. Certainly, it is a love poem without any stretch of the imagination. It is clearly a love poem to her husband. The title states that, obviously. But she's kind of being saucy, and she's like, um, nobody can love a man as much as I love you, and women, just try to tell me that you've got somebody as wonderful as my husband. So she's kind of showing off a little bit for a Puritan. Really, that was pretty saucy. Um, so she's, reflecting on how wonderful her love is and how great it is, and she ends being a good Puritan woman by saying, if we live really well in this life, we do what we're supposed to, then hopefully we'll be able to live together forever and ever. So she's got that predestination is sort of in there, but she's really hoping that they're both predestined to end up together in heaven. So next we have Miss Mary Rowlandson. Um, she is a very interesting character. The title of her story is A Narrative of the Captivity, Sufferings, and Removes of Miss Mary Rowlandson. So she was born Mary White in England in 1637, and she dies in Connecticut in 1711. She was brought to America when she was a child and lived with her family in Salem in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. She married a Puritan minister, Joseph Rowlandson, in 1656, and in February of 1676, during King Philip's War, she, along with 24 others, was taken captive by the Native Americans. In 1682, she writes one of the first captivity narratives, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But I did just want to mention, if you don't know what King Philip's War is or was, it was a brief war, excuse me, in which it's called King Philip's War, not because there was a king of England or any place else involved in it. The Native American who's the chief who was warring against the Puritans, they called him King Philip. Not sure why, but that's what they did. And so his war, he was warring against the Puritans because basically his tribe had gotten fed up with the Puritans moving in on their land and killing their animals and taking over and farming their fields. And really, the Puritans just came in and took over everything. And so that was really, the Native Americans didn't like it, as I'm sure if somebody moved into your house and pushed you out the door and took over your home, you would be a little angry about that. So these Native Americans were angry, and they were going around the countryside, burning down homes, taking captives, and killing people who had encroached on their property. Back to Rowlandson. Her story becomes a blockbuster in England because it describes a mysterious lifestyle that most Europeans would not understand. So this is a really big deal. Again, it's published in England and it's super popular. It's like, Stephen King put out a book, because, again, it's written by a woman, and it's written with a lot of violence and sensationalism. And she does this deliberately, um, to appeal to her readers. She uses vivid descriptions with what I call a gross out appeal. Um, for example, she describes how the natives survive and sustain themselves when there is nothing to eat by boiling bones so that maggots come out of the marrow. Kind of disgusting, right? And she knew that as she's describing this, that it would be incredibly gross and disgusting to the Europeans, but she wanted to do that. She wanted to show or demonstrate just how disgusting she saw the Native Americans. And she uses particular words, um, to really show her, to demonstrate her feelings or thoughts about the Native Americans. She calls them enemies, savages, devils, Satan worshippers. And she does this very specifically to present them in a very specific light. Um, she writes her story to demonstrate that God may try his people, but through belief and patience you can persevere, that it is important to wait for God's time. And in fact, if you were to read the whole narrative, you would find out that she is offered a chance to escape, but decides not to do so because she does not want um, anybody, she wants to do it in God's time. So she has tribulations. She experiences um, tribulations, the death of her 6-year-old daughter, Sarah. And this is pretty awful. I mean, this is pretty terrible experience. I personally can't imagine going through it. But it takes Sarah 9 days to die after she's been attacked by the Indians. And so instead of referring to Sarah as her daughter, she refers to her daughter as an it. And that seems kind of really bizarre and strange and weird, but I think it's kind of her way of distancing herself from the horror that she's experiencing. And it in no way, I don't feel in any way demonstrates that she does not love Sarah, because she really considers killing herself when Sarah dies. She doesn't know what's happened to her other two children. And she certainly, while she is in captive, is an example of an other. She's a stranger. She's afraid. She's got to be terrified. I mean, this is a complete culture she has no reference for, doesn't understand. And she's very afraid of what they're going to do with her. And she doesn't know. After a while, she figures out that they're probably not going to kill her because they don't do so immediately. But she doesn't know when she's first taken captive what's going to happen to her. So it's a pretty terrifying period for her. Her story is a model of Christian tribulation and perseverance, so it appeals to a Christian audience. And this is really important. This is what we call didactic literature. It was written for a very particular purpose to demonstrate what it means to be a good Christian and to persevere through the trials of evil. And she shares both positive and negative experiences with the natives, which I think in some cases makes them more human than not. But ultimately, she sees them as savages, as tools of God, and God preserves the natives and uses them as a people, as an instrument in her own life. So, again, we believe in predestination, so this was predestined to happen, and it was a test of her faith, a test of her belief in God, um, to be treated so horrifically by these savages, by these devils. And the fact that she persevered demonstrates what a good Christian she is. Next, we have Cotton Mather. So, good old Mr. Mather. He is quite an interesting character. He's born February 12th, 1663, in Boston, Massachusetts, to a family of famous Puritan ministers. So, Mather is actually what we would consider American. He was born and raised in America. He was quite the intellectual one. He began his education at Harvard at the age of 12. He received his Master's of Arts at 18 and felt that he was called into the ministry. So he wanted to be a minister at the age of 18, which again, people did not live as long as they live today, but still to be 18 years old and to know what your calling is I think extraordinary. Most of us when we are 18 today have no clue of what we wanted to be when we grow up. And maybe many of you still don't know or you're still trying to figure that out. So at 18 he wants to be a minister. However, there was a little itty bitty problem. He has a terrible stutter. And because he had this terrible stutter, he could not immediately go into the clergy. He couldn't go into the clergy. And so he thinks about becoming a doctor. Doctor, minister, well, we're both taking care of, or they're both taking care of people, so in different senses. But he works on his stutter. His friends help him work through it, and he preaches his first sermon in 1680 and becomes an ordained minister in 1685 at the ripe old age of 22 years. So he has had quite a lot of experience um, by the time he's 22 years of age, in that he's an incredibly well educated person um, and is moving on in his career. Mather is considered one of the most influential Puritan ministers. Um, excuse me. He's published over 400 pieces on topics from witchcraft to smallpox. Remember, he wanted to be a doctor. And in fact, there is historical records that say that he um, uh, practiced smallpox vaccination or that kind of concept on his own children when they were young. So he dabbled in a lot of things. In 1684, he publishes his account, which is called Remarkable Providences, which described in depth the satanic possession of the Goodwin children in Boston. Okay, and this is important because this leads up to the Salem witch trials, and many believe that it was the reading of this piece that kind of um encouraged or allowed the Salem witch trials to occur. He strongly believes that Boston is the battleground with the devil. This is where the devil is, and we've got to, as good Puritans, fight with the devil. Eternal damnation is frequently one of his themes, and he served as an advisor, not as a judge, but as an advisor to the judges during the Salem witch trials. And this is important as you read on, and you'll see why. I wanted to share this with you because I thought this was so remarkable. In the preface to one of his children's books, he warns young readers, they which lie must go to their father, the devil, into everlasting burning. They which never pray, God will pour out his wrath upon them, and when they bed and pray in hellfire, God will not forgive them, but there they must lie forever. Are you willing to go to hell and burn with the devil and his angels? That's pretty darn scary, if you ask me, for children at the beginning of a children's book. So, yeah, he was a pretty serious guy. Certainly not traditional children's books like we see today. So his role in the Salem witch trials is a little contradictory. At one point, he cautions the judges against the use of spectral evidence. but then recommends the detection of witchcraft. So I'm not sure what he means by how you're supposed to find witches. Don't use spectral evidence. And spectral evidence is that of evidence that comes from ghosts. Okay, so spectral is another term for ghosts or um, some kind of visitation. So he warns against doing that, but he still wants people to detect witchcraft. Eyewitnesses, and this is again another story about Mather that I think really demonstrates the kind of person that he was. Eyewitnesses reported that Mather supported the hanging of former Salem minister George Burroughs, even though it was reported that Burroughs recited a perfect rendition of the Lord's Prayer while in the gallows. This was something Mather believed was impossible for anyone guilty of an alliance with the devil. So you couldn't say the Lord's Prayer correctly if you were in alliance with the devil. You couldn't recite it. The crowd was so moved that some wanted to prevent the execution. Mather, however, mounted on his horse, proclaimed that Burroughs was no ordained minister, and that the devil has often been transformed into an angel of light. With those words, under the tearful gaze of an ambivalent crowd, George Burroughs was hanged. So, Mather really supported this hanging of what we now know was an innocent man, but which, by Mather's own definition, was an innocent man because he didn't do or he was able to recite the Lord's Prayer. So this is a famous image of the trials. There's a woman on the floor having seizures or fits or what have you. Um, and you'll see in further readings upon the Salem witch trials that there are lots of different ways to look at it. So I will be really interested to find out what you think about the Salem witch trials. And I will be talking to you again soon. Take care.